What's up, everybody? Welcome to a brand new episode of MUT Tips. I am your host, Sean Taylor from the Made Up Theater, and let's jump into today's topic of viewer mail. Today's episode of MUT Tips is going to revolve around some viewer mail. So I'm going to answer some questions that were sent to me either in YouTube comments or on Facebook, or also sent to me directly through email. Let's jump into the first question. The first comment comes from Danelle in response to my MUT Tips episode 55, all about conflict, and she writes, I would love a demonstration to help clarify how to delve in conflict-based scenes without resorting to conflict. In episode 55 of MUT Tips, I talked all about conflict and ways we can approach it in different lights rather than just, treating it how we always do, with just fighting and arguing. So I gave examples of doing improv scenes based around a conflict, like breaking up with somebody or a custody battle or a heist that's gone wrong. And I encourage you to do those types of scenes, but see if you can do it in a way that does not result a conflict or a fight of some sort. And a way to approach this specifically is a very important term, acceptance, okay? So if you go into this type of scene, maybe the two characters deal with the acceptance of what's happening rather than fighting it, Acceptance is big in conflict because it means that you're accepting a loss or you're accepting just the reality of what's happening rather than, fighting against it. Conflict comes from you have your own truth and you're rebelling against the other truth. So if it was a heist gone wrong, maybe it's two characters who are in an underground bunker. And yeah, sure, they could fight and be like, oh, you messed up that part of the heist, or you messed up this part. You didn't have the getaway car ready for me when I needed it. But instead, since they know the cops are about to just ambush them, maybe they reminisce, They accept the inevitable, right? They're gonna be arrested and thrown in jail for the rest of their lives. So maybe before that happens, rather than fighting, they come together and they talk about how they met, reminisce on, what got them into the game, or, reminisce about their friendship that they had, right? That's an interesting scene rather than two people just fighting back and forth about something that ultimately it's not gonna matter in a few minutes. They're about to be arrested. And maybe like a custody battle, for example. Maybe it's more amicable, right? The best way to approach conflict is, treat the scene like you like your scene partner, right? If you go into a scene knowing that you like them or even you love them, and at that point you can approach it rather in just a different way that is not just putting the boxing gloves on and just having at it, right? So like I said, acceptance is big in these types of scenes. Rather than going to default of just having a fight, find the acceptance in the scene. Find the reality that you have and just accept it and expand upon it. The next question I have is from Andy, and Andy writes, do you have any ideas about how to perform improv in a Zoom meeting environment? So with shelter in place right now, video conferencing is the future of improv. It's how we're gonna be improvising with each other for the foreseeable future. And yes, I really miss being in a room with either my students or my fellow performers and being able to improvise in more of a close contact setting. But hey, this is the reality that we're living with, and ultimately as improvisers, we need to accept it. And we can find a lot of fun through video conferencing, just like Zoom or Google Hangouts or Skype. And ultimately, the biggest thing that we need to focus on, I'm still learning about it myself, is I think that these video conferencing software devices that we're gonna be using are gonna help us a little bit with listening, okay? There's less emphasis on performing on a stage, and I'll be honest, this happens to me sometimes. I get distracted sometimes with my stage, with my environment, but when I'm gonna start improvising with my students or even fellow cast members in more of a video conference setting, I'm gonna be more focused on their words and expanding upon those words and directly yes-anding them. So the biggest thing with improvising on Zoom or any video conferencing software is just be patient and listen. Actively listen to each other, okay? Obviously, there's gonna be some technical difficulties that might spring up sometimes, like audio delays. So for audio delays, allow pauses, okay? And another great tool for just jumping into Zoom is make your first improvised scenes kind of set in the atmosphere of like a video conferencing type scenario, okay? Like maybe you're dating someone, but it's distinctly in a video conferencing setup, right? Or maybe you're having a meeting and do a group scene in that meeting together in that, just that scenario of it's gonna be in like a Zoom conferencing system, right? If you watch SNL right now, this is what they're doing a lot of. They're kind of embracing the reality of this is what we're doing. This is a video conferencing scene. And rather than just like oh, this is gonna be a scene where we're set at a park, but we're just kind of in our, our living rooms or in our offices. They kind of just lean into what their setup is right now, okay? So try that out first, okay? Give yourself scenarios that are just directly related to video conferencing on Zoom, and then build up to actually improvising in scenarios outside of this environment. It's a great way to just kind of tiptoe yourself into the shallow end and then move on into the deep end. But really, one big thing, listen more, okay? Deliberate pauses, really listen to what your partner said, repeat what they said if you even want to, that helps a lot, and then react. The next question comes from Holly, and Holly writes, I find myself freezing up on stage and just drawing a blank. Any advice for how to handle this? If you're drawing a blank or freezing up on stage, it's totally natural, okay? I find myself having that moment sometimes as well. When I do an improvised narrative, for example, I might get caught up in the plot and be like, oh my gosh, this is supposed to happen. I'm confused with this offer, does it connect? And I'm just overthinking rather than just treating it simple. So in improv, treat it simple, okay? If you're worrying about plot devices or a storyline, you're gonna get confused and it's gonna cause you to freeze up sometime. And ultimately, improvised scenes, when it comes down to it, it's mostly just about the improvised relationship that we're presenting. So focus on your scene partner. If you find yourself blanking and freezing up, treat it as a character choice rather than just like you as an improviser or freezing up. Like I've had moments where I just go to silence, okay? And that allows me to kind of collect my thoughts and go back to just a simple choice, just maybe moving across the stage or just like sitting in silence. That is very effective. Silence is, I think, the most essential tool in improv that we sometimes neglect. So go to silence sometimes. A great way to start like an improvised scene is just start with organic silence. Don't even start with an activity. Just start standing neutral and allow simple movements and simple facial expressions and simple proximity. Allow it to expand until the first line of dialogue comes out, okay? So don't overthink it, okay? Get out of your head and just treat improv nice and simple, okay? You got it. The next comment comes from Brady, and Brady writes, my teacher made me watch this, so automatic dislike. The next question comes from Raj, and Raj writes, during this shelter in place, do you have any recommendations on improv to watch right now? That's a great question, Raj, because ultimately in the shelter-in-place environment that we're living in, we need some improv goodness from the comfort of our own homes. And I got some recommendations. My first one is kind of obvious. You might have even watched it already, but if you haven't, check it out on Netflix. It's Middleditch and Schwartz, okay? Middleditch and Schwartz features Thomas Middleditch and Ben Schwartz, and they perform 3 separate episodes where they do an improvised, essentially a narrative or a play based on a suggestion from the audience that comes in the form of an interview. The cool thing about these 3 different shows is they are very raw, It doesn't seem like there's a lot of editing going on. It seems like it's just a final cut where not a lot of fat is trimmed. You get to see what they performed, and that's cool because you essentially get to see like an authentic representation of improv. You get to see the mistakes on stage. They have problems sometimes where like they address someone as a different character, they forget names, they might like get a little confused about where the story is going. The 3rd episode in particular is really interesting because they do seem to have some moments where they're looking at each other in the eyes and thinking, oh my gosh, what the heck's going on? And they kind of have to just deal with the problem, fix it, and then move on. And it's really kind of like admirable, where they don't give up on the set, right? It's gonna be on Netflix. They can't do that. They deal with the problems and the mistakes that are happening and just incorporate the stumble into the dance. And I admire their commitment to it. It's really interesting. Watch all 3 episodes. They play a bunch of different characters. They'll go back and forth sometimes and play their partner's character. It's really cool. I really recommend it. Cannot recommend it enough. A few other examples online is if you go on YouTube, you can check out Ask Cat, which I recommended in my last video, I believe, where you just see a monologist give some stories and improvisers will riff off those stories and perform scenes. Another really good example is some of my favorite improvisers and teachers is Colleen Doyle and Jason Schatz, okay? They perform a show called Dummy, and there are a few performances on YouTube. Just type in Dummy, Colleen Doyle, Jason Schatz. I'll try to write some recommended videos in the comments down below. Now the thing about this is it's 2 very patient improvisers. That's what I like about it the most. It's not necessarily like really funny throughout. it's very natural and real and raw. Two people, a lot of times they just start by just sitting down in a chair and just having a conversation, establishing that relationship and just taking their time. And it's really interesting to watch because I think sometimes in improv, we're trying to go so fast. And that's where the mistakes come from. We're going too fast to the point where we're missing stuff and dropping important choices and gifts. So check that out. Colleen Doyle, Jason Schatz, and Dummy, I really recommend that. My last question for the video comes from Steph. And Steph writes, have you ever dealt with an audience that doesn't like you? This is a very interesting question because ultimately as performers, we want to be liked by the audience, right? We want that validation. But sometimes the audience, I don't know, they can turn on you sometimes. Not even just the performers, but just you in general. And it's happened to me a few times. I remember one time I was performing at like this church event and there was like over 100 people and we were playing a game. And for some reason, they turned on me. Like, they actually liked me for a majority of the show, but there was just some moment where they just kind of rebelled against me and it, like, even booed me a little bit. There was kind of some jest in it, so I didn't take it personally, and that's the first thing. Don't take it personally. And I just kind of incorporated it into my presentation, where I actually started to play kind of like a bad guy, right? I kind of leaned into it a little bit. I started to be, like, in wrestling, a heel, where I wanted the boos at that point. So sometimes when that does happen, you know, sometimes it helps to lean into it and make it more of a character choice that the audience doesn't like you, so you need to be bigger, right? Like a lot of times in improvised narratives, I choose to be an antagonistic character. So I'm choosing to be a character that the audience is meant to not like, and I love doing those characters. So if they don't like me and I'm not getting laughs, that means I'm doing a good job, right? I don't play antagonists necessarily to get laughs. I play it to play that role so that we can ultimately make the story more impactful, make the protagonist's journey to their rise and fall and rise again more interesting, right? More stakes are involved. So if you ever feel like the audience doesn't like you, first of all, it might just be you thinking that. A lot of times audiences will like your show and just not express it in the way that you think with a ha 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 ha, like out loud LOLs. A lot of times they're more introverted and more internalized, so don't take it personally. Remember this, you can't hear a smile. If you look out there, you might see them smiling and they might be enjoying your show, okay? The spotlights can blind you from that fact. So my recommendation ultimately is if you can, try leaning into it, okay? Try to be a character who maybe the audience doesn't like. And the thing is a lot of times the next show that you perform in, it's gonna be totally different, so don't get down, okay? It was one show. It was that one bad show that happened, that one rough show. Let it go off your shoulder, learn from it, and move on because the next time you're gonna kill it, okay? And that concludes this episode of MUT Tips, everybody. Thank you so much for checking it out. I really appreciate it. If you enjoyed the video, like it down below. Comment with somebody you'd like addressed in a future video. I'm gonna start definitely responding to comments and doing some more viewer mail segments, so I'd love to hear them, okay? I might feature it in a full video, or I might feature it in one of these viewer comment sections. Also, subscribe on YouTube. I'd love to see those numbers go up. We're getting close to 1,000. We're still a few hundred off, but hey, we're getting there, right? So subscribe. It really helps us out and informs you of upcoming videos. Thank you so much, everybody. I'll see you next time for another episode of MUT Tips. Bye.